My name is Andrew Domison, and as always, it is a tremendous privilege to be your host for the Speaking for Him podcast. I'm super excited that you have joined me today for this encouragement for the journey that we call the Christian life, because as you know, this journey is a marathon and not a sprint, and we need each other. I love to share with you new entertainment from a Christian perspective and movies in particular that families will enjoy together. And I'm really excited to share with you the movie review that I have for you today, because I had the opportunity to see an advanced screening of this film, and it is called Young Washington. And as we dig into this film, I think one of the things that sticks out to me about it is that it is the telling of some stories of the young life of George Washington. A lot of times we look at George Washington on our dollar bill and we think of him as this elder statesman, which of course he wasn't that old at the start of America, and many of our founding fathers were actually young, but there was a big lead up, to say the least, to him actually becoming the chief executive of our country, and the first chief executive at that. And so it was really neat to be able to watch this film, Young Washington, which is directed by John Irwin and is part of his ever expansive wonder project, and to really see kind of the start of the story of one of the greatest founding fathers in the history of our country. And I hope it's a good reminder to people to continue to care about American history, to think about the people that really put their lives on the line so that you and I could have freedom to live in the great country that we do. Because, not everything's perfect. I've talked about this a lot, and if you want to get into these issues in more detail, I would encourage you to check out the Culture Watch podcast every Monday. But that being said, it is still one of the greatest countries in the world. Why do I say that? I say that primarily because America has had some very dark stains on their past, but the Constitution has been a document that has given us the tools to correct many of these dark stains. And I'm very proud today to live in America as we are looking at the 250th anniversary of the founding of our country in just a couple short weeks. So as we look at this story, we look at it through this lens of just being thankful for the founders of our country and getting a glimpse at the fortitude that made George Washington who he is a very exciting part of this process. Well, before I jump into the meat of my review, I want to share with you our quote of the day. And as I share the quote of the day, I want to say that to me, this was one of the biggest things that leapt out as I watched this film. George Washington makes the comment in this film, failure is a great teacher. And I want to just pause for a moment and think about that statement, because I feel like that is one of the biggest things that our kids are missing today. This idea that failure is a great teacher, and that if we teach our kids to fail, it can actually be a key to them succeeding. That seems backwards, but think about it. If you never fail at anything, chances are you haven't tried anything of consequence. It's kind of like this idea also, which is complementary, which is we need to do hard things. I read a book several years ago by that title, and the idea of it was that we often stay in our comfort zone and don't stretch ourselves. And as a result, we don't accomplish big things for God. But we have an opportunity to do just that if we will step out in faith. And as I said, failure is a big part of that. And I'm really thankful for the failures that I have had in life that have given me the resilience to continue to do what I've been called to do. You know, I've had issues with employment. I've had issues with interpersonal relationships. None of it is fun. But I can tell you this, that God is faithful and that he always is there for me and he always guides and directs me. And often when I feel the most discouraged, it's because God is getting ready to do something amazing in my life. And I think that he can do the same in your life. One of the things we need to do, though, is we need to realize that what God thinks is amazing and what we think is amazing may be two very different things. And we need to be willing to trust God to give us the things that he really wants to give us to mold us into the person that he really wants us to be. And so with that, let's jump into the main portion of our review of Young Washington. So as we jump into this movie review, I just want to share with you some of the cast. It's actually quite a star-studded cast if you step back and think about it, because we have Andy Serkis, who is one of Washington's direct generals. We have Joel Smallbone, who has a role here. And for those who do not know who Joel Smallbone is, he's half of For King and Country, and I talked about him last when he played his own father in the movie Unsung Hero. So he's in this film. And we also have Ben Kingsley, who's a very famous actor. So there's a lot of interesting names in this film, and they give a lot in their roles, and they're all believable, and I just really appreciated it. And I also want to talk a little bit about the young man who played young George Washington, because it's a pretty tall order to play the father of our country. And so let me give a little credit to William Franklin Miller. William, I don't know if I'll ever get a chance to talk to you, but I really appreciated your role in this film. I feel like he put his all into this role, and I'm really grateful that John Irwin was able to secure him for the role. Interestingly enough, he's British, but that is actually somewhat appropriate considering the beginning of the film. So as we continue on, let's keep that in mind. But before I get any further into my review, let me share with you the trailer for Young Washington.
What happened, Washington? All those bullet holes in your jacket. How are you alive?
I don't know.
You have no military service.
And it's just around the bend.
You are a boy. You are not British, yet they send you to speak for them. So that when you fail, they'll have someone to blame.
Young Washington, you lost in the New World.
Who does own this land, if not the one who has the will to tame it? You do not want to start a war. So what do? We fight!
to ground! There is no retreat!
What are you called?
My name is George Washington.
Help us make this the #1 movie on America's 250th. Pre-order tickets at angel.com/250. Exclusively in theaters July 3rd.
So there you have the trailer for Young Washington, and I would encourage you to pre-order some tickets and to bring a group of people with you. I will probably go see this one more time when it is officially in theaters, because it was a very good film. As we start out the meat of this review, I just want to point out that, as I said earlier, this film highlights an era of history and an era of George Washington's life that we don't often talk about. So in the beginning of the film, the colonies are still subjects of the British crown. And that's an important part of this story, because George Washington has a great desire to be a British soldier. His half-brother Lawrence is one, and after his father dies, tragically, his brother Lawrence becomes one of his big mentors, and he wants nothing more than to follow his brother into the British service. And he actually goes to some officers in the British Army and says, "This is what I want. I want to serve with you guys. I want to be one of your men." And they said, "Well, if you want to serve in the military, you can do militia, but you can't really be a British officer because you don't have land or property. Land or property that you work, which is Mount Vernon, is you're actually officially your brother's property, so you can't be in the regular military." But he persists, and he eventually gets a command spot with the militia. He goes into service with them. He first goes to negotiate with the French, because the British want the French to leave the territory that they're in. I believe it is the Pennsylvania territory, if I remember correctly. And they say they're not going anywhere. So that prompts George Washington and the men that are with him to fight them. And they set up a fort called Fort Necessity, and they end up losing the skirmish that they had with them, and losing it pretty badly. And then the British officers are like, "George, what did you do? You basically launched us into war." And George leaves with his tail between his legs. And so then he's dejected, and he goes back to his mother. And this is kind of a pivotal part of the movie, because he's not sure what to do. The only thing he wanted to do was to be a British officer. That's never going to happen now. So how do you deal with that kind of setback? And it's kind of interesting to think about, if he had succumbed to that, if he had said, "Because I failed at that, I am not going to try to be a soldier anymore, and I'm definitely not going to try to be an officer of the British Crown, because I tried and I failed." But the reason that he's a founding father, and the reason that we talk about him today, is because he did not give up, because he persisted. He was constantly talking to people who could make a difference in his life. One of the things that he did throughout his life was to read good books. You know, I've had a Speaking for Him book club on this podcast before, because I realize the need to read good books. And there's a common phrase, readers are leaders. And I don't think it's just a phrase. I think it is very accurate. But to get back on track with our story, he goes back to his mom dejected, and kind of interesting, early on in the story, I think even as a young boy, because there's a flashback where he's just a young boy, he says that he wants to be a soldier, and his mom doesn't want him to be. You know, he already has a stepbrother who is. His mom would prefer that he not be, but he goes anyway because it's his greatest desire. So then when he comes back with his tail between his legs and he's struggling and his brother is sick, and of course, during the course of the movie, his brother eventually dies and he has to deal with that grief. But as he's trying to process everything, his mom has a conversation with him, and she actually urges him to go back. But there's a really key difference that she talks to him about with him going back into service. She said, before, you are going for yourself and to make a name for yourself. This time, go as God's servant. And I thought that was so significant, because when we try to do things in our own strength, we will fail every time. And the successes that we do have will be short-lived and not have eternal consequences. But when we go in the power of Jesus, and when we do the thing that he calls us to, we know that success will happen. Now again, success is something that is hard to understand, because we think of success as having money or having prestige, and God thinks of success in a very different way. God says, have you done the thing that I've asked you to do? You're not responsible for the way people respond to the message I give you. You're just responsible for delivering the message. And one thing that George did is he ended formal schooling very early on in his life as a young child, but he never stopped reading, and he became a surveyor because he was able to learn enough about surveying to get his surveyor's license, and his brother gave him a surveyor's compass, and these things really set him up for success. But when he went back, to get back on track with our synopsis, to the battlefield with the attitude of doing it for the Lord, he had a renewed tenacity where he was not going to quit. So he went back to battle in the French and Indian War, and he actually got real sick while he was there, at least according to the movie. And he battled through that, and he took leadership on the battlefield. And there was actually an officer who falsely said that their leadership wanted them to retreat. And then Washington's general, as he's dying, the one played by Andy Serkis, says, no, there is no retreat. Go and save your men and fight to the end. And we see the resilience of George Washington as he fights for the crown, and he fights for his fellow men, and he saves a bunch of his fellow men because of his courage and conviction. And because now he's fighting for God, he has a greater reason and resolve to succeed. And that's the basic synopsis of this film. Again, I would really encourage you to go and watch it with your family. Let me talk about some things that I really liked about this film. First of all, I liked the fact that it showed George Washington as a struggling human being. You know, sometimes we can look at our founding fathers as superhuman people, but the reality is they were simply people at a place in history who did extraordinary things because God allowed them to be used for such a time as they were in the timeline of history. And it reminds me, as does reading the Bible, that God's not looking for extraordinary people to do his work. He's looking for ordinary people who are willing to be used of God as his servants, and then he will take care of the rest. Remember, in Philippians it says, "It is God who worketh in you, both to will and to do of his good pleasure." And so that's an important thing for us to remember. I really like the relationship between Lawrence and George as depicted in this film, because it shows that a brother can be a huge influence in another brother's life, especially in a case where a father has been taken from them. And you always wonder a little bit when you watch these movies how accurate and true to life they are. I'm sure there are certain liberties taken, but it was really neat to see this brother relationship lived out on screen, and the fact that Lawrence cared about George and his future. And one of the reasons that George was able to serve in the military, even though he didn't have the pedigree of his brother, was because his brother was rendered unable to serve due to consumption. So that was kind of an interesting thing. I also thought it was interesting to see the love of a mother, to see how much George's mother cared for him and how much she tried to help him. First of all, encouraging Lawrence to help him, and then encouraging him to keep his chin up and to go back into the war, even though that was not something that she really wanted him to do, because her support mattered. And I think it's very interesting as George Washington is in the battlefield, especially the second time, he goes through unscathed despite having multiple bullet holes in his jacket. And I think even having multiple horses shot out from under him. I know some people may say, are those tall tales? But they seem to be a real part of his story, that God was preserving him for such a time as this. And I'm reminded of the story of Job, where the devil goes to God and says, Job's only serving you because you've given him so much. And then God gives Satan certain control, but ultimate control over Job's life was still in God's hands. And I think you see that with young George Washington, that ultimate control was in God's hands, and that he had great plans for George Washington. And of course, as people who are looking back at George Washington's life for the 250th birthday of America, we know that he would become the first U.S. president and the only one elected unanimously, because people had such great respect for him. And I love the fact also that he commanded respect everywhere he went, even as a young 20, 21, 22-year-old young man, because he carried himself with dignity. His brother introduced him to rules of civility, which he copied down, and later, even though they weren't original with him, they would later become Washington's rules for civility. And so that was a very interesting thing that happened. They had a little bit on the movie about his relationship with Sally Fairfax, which I understand was somebody that he was in love with before he met his wife, Martha Washington. And so that was kind of interesting. They didn't really dwell on that, but it's an interesting part of his story that they did talk about a little bit. I think it's interesting to watch his rise in the ranks, because then after he was successful in battle, they gave him a higher rank and gave him more men. And it's kind of interesting because you see the beginning of the colonists pulling away from the British Crown, because at the end of the movie, he asks for a change of uniform and asks that the colonists be given blue jackets instead of the red coats of the British. So it's a little nod to what's coming. And so I think overall it was a very good movie. It's a war movie and it's PG-13, so you want to keep that in mind when you bring your kids. I wish there was a little bit more about faith and a little bit more about Washington's journey with faith. Of course, in this film, he's still young, so maybe he hasn't come to the place of faith that he would later when he would speak freely about the importance of reverencing God in the Bible. But I would have liked to see a little bit more on the faith end of things. And that's really the only gripe I have with the film. I felt like it was very well done. I felt like it captured the realities of war without being overly gratuitous. And I am just in awe that God has allowed so many gifted Christian filmmakers to bring their skills to bear in the era in which we now live, and to do wide theatrical releases of movies that really make you think. You know, I just released my review of The Breadwinner starring Nate Bargatze, and that one's a comedy. And it's not very deep, although I do think that it has lessons to teach us. And now here is Young Washington, which is a historic epic. And I just really like the fact that we have the Irwin brothers and the Kendrick brothers and Kingdom Story Company. So many people who are dedicated to making solid, family-friendly, and Christian programming. It's a very exciting time to be alive in the United States of America, and I hope they are able to continue to go forth with boldness and share these stories. And so I just want to encourage you to get out and watch this movie. I really think it will be a blessing to you, and I really think that more and more people need to see this. And even if you don't buy into everything that this movie talks about, here's what a movie like this should do for you. It should encourage you to study history for yourself. No book or movie should be taken at face value. A book or a movie, especially about something that is true and epic like the life of George Washington, should encourage us to investigate the life of such a man. And I know a lot of people in the secular world are going to have major problems with who George Washington was as a man because he was flawed. But I want to end today kind of by issuing a challenge I issued several years ago, which is, if someone were to make a statue of you for some amazing reason in the future, what's one thing that 20 years after it happens could get it torn down because of your past? Because I think sometimes when we look at these historical figures and we dwell on their flaws, then we forget the amazing things that they have done. We should never forget that they are flawed individuals. We should never put them on pedestals that are too high. But we should also not dwell on their flaws to the extent that we forget the great things that they did for our country. George Washington led the Continental Army through many battles of the American Revolution. He helped our country's troops survive Valley Forge. And as I said, he became our first president. We owe a lot of the freedoms we have today to the man that George Washington was, flaws and all. So I just want you to remember that as you go to this movie and as you celebrate the 4th of July. Is America perfect? Absolutely not. But you'd be hard-pressed to find somewhere better to live and to raise a family. But it only stays a good place and a place full of liberty if we are willing to stand for liberty. And one of the ways that we stand for liberty is to share historical epics like this with our friends and family and to encourage them to study history for themselves. Because as the old saying goes, those who fail to learn from history will be doomed to repeat it. As I close, I just want to give this film 4.5 out of 5 stars and encourage you to go see this with your family. I think it's very important to watch this film, to think about one of the greatest statesmen in history as a young man, and to realize the fortitude that it took for him to accomplish the things that he did. The decisions that he made as a young boy to be a bookworm, to write down the rules of civility, and to go into the military and to go back to the military despite failure are the things that would later make him the first president of the United States. And that's an important thing for us to remember, because you never know when you or someone you love could be on the cusp of greatness for the Lord Jesus Christ. Every journey and side path that we go on is important to the ultimate goal that God has for us. And whatever the ultimate task that he has for us, the ultimate goal for each and every one of us is the same: to be conformed more and more each day to the image of the Lord Jesus Christ. I hope this review has blessed you, and that if it has, you will share it with your family and friends, and that you will make the decision in a couple weeks when this movie comes to theaters to go and see it and to talk about it with your family. We need to let America know that movies like this are important to us, and we need to let our kids know that studying history has always been important, but never more so than now when so many people are attacking it. Well, that's what I have to share with you for today's episode of the Speaking for Him podcast. I hope that if you've enjoyed this podcast, as I said, that you would share it with your family and friends. Maybe pick 3 to 5 people who have never heard of Speaking for Him and share it with them so that they can glean from this important resource. You can share your comments, questions, or concerns with the contact information that's about to roll at the end of the show. And with that being said, have a great week. And as always, keep serving the best of masters.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Your host has been Andrew Gomison, founder of Speaking for Him. For information on today's show and to leave us comments and voicemails, please visit Speaking4Him. That is speaking numeral 4 him.blogspot.com. You can find Andrew's ministry at speaking4him.com. That's speaking the number 4 HIM.com. And when you look for us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or all other major podcast platforms, let us know what you think of the podcast by leaving a rating and a review. Intro music for this podcast is provided by Audio Kraken. Transition music is provided by Superstate. Both of these tracks are available free of charge from pond5.com, pond numeral 5.com.